Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Tonight's broadcast is titled The Impact of Peer Groups and Milieu on Your Child. And I was just saying before we started that when I thought about this title, I thought it to be a very practical title and a very simple and straightforward title. But what that did is it brought me into a lot of deep areas in talking about the context and what the context does to shape our personalities, to shape our behavior, to impact us. So I really enjoyed preparing for this. I will get to the practical piece, but I'm going to start off with some theoretical context. First of all, to set the stage for that more practical discussion. I shared this quote in The Journey of the Heroic Parent. It's a quote from David Foster Wallace. And he writes, "There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, 'What the hell is water?'" I said this just last night when I was doing a broadcast for somebody, that the fish is the last one to discover water. And the only way you can really see clearly the water is to experience the not water. So the first thing that I want to say tonight is context matters. And to see our context clearly, we have to get out of it. That's why traveling to other cultures, spending the night at another family when you're a young child, meeting your in-laws can give you a better sense of your context. That's really what therapy is at a fundamental level. It's getting into another context. And in therapy, it's not about proximity or place. It's about experiencing a different kind of sensibility. So the idea of context is super impactful. I love what Tion Dayton says about our children in the opening sentences of her book Emotional Sobriety. She writes, "Our children don't become who we tell them to be. They become who we are." As a therapist, I need no convincing that children live in the affective space between their parents. They live in their unspoken and sometimes unfelt emotional world. Much of parenting is implicit rather than explicit, which is why children become who we are rather than who we tell them to be. Our children drink us up like little sponges. We are showing them who we want them to become. There's so much to unpack with this quote. First of all, the idea that so much of parenting is implicit and that we communicate to them in thousands, millions, perhaps billions of ways who we want them to be. And children just absorb that message. And that speaks to a big theme of the work on these broadcasts, which is that's why it's so important for parents to look at their childhood, to explore their child, to unpack it, to unravel it, to be able to be critical of one's earliest context. And by critical, I don't mean what people think of when they think of the connotation of the word critical as a negative light, but to be able to look at it with discernment, to be able to see what was unspoken, what was unsaid in the process. So we see how children, and it's part of our neurobiology, part of our species, that they absorb the messages. They end up becoming the way that that we are. When a therapist makes a joke or even a serious statement about you're going to marry your mother and your father, what he or she or they are communicating is that there's no way to escape your context without a lot of work, without a lot of effort, without some big shift. And in many ways, that's what wilderness therapy is. It's a big shift. So let's talk about context a little bit more. It's not just the family of origin, although that is primary, but it's family, it's school, it's peers, it's religion, it's siblings, it's community, it's the media, it's the country, it's the world, it's the time. It's the time that you grow up in. It's everything. People always ask me to weight things for them. Like if all of these things are in play, if my child has a learning difference, for example, and he or she spends so much of their time in a school setting, then why so much weight or emphasis on the parents? And that's because, first of all, so much happens in the first 5 years. in the home, and that the family is the only thing that we have control over because we're the family. So thinking about, going back and fixing a community or fixing a culture or fixing a time doesn't make any sense. The only thing we have control over is ourselves in this equation. Our historical impact, we have no control over, but we have control over whether we shift or whether we evolve, whether we grow in this process. Genetics are part of the context, right? Genetics are the given. There's always a given and a made when it comes to people, and genetics are part of that context, right? They're the context of the two contributing parent genes, the genetic makeup. The womb is the earliest contexts. There's plenty of research that talks about how stress and trauma, how substance use, uh, how different things can affect outside of the body, can affect the child in utero. The culture and the historical context can't be understated here either. That's not even, I don't even need to sell that. Everybody knows that. My mother grew up in a different time. My father grew up in a different time. In my mother's day, she used to tell me when I was younger, Elvis was the great thing to worry about for her parents. The way that he shook his hips on the Ed Sullivan Show was the great threat, my grandparents thought, to my mother's moral development. So it was a different time. Really, when I think about contexts, I think most importantly, the mind, the thoughts, and the feelings of others. The reason that I am not I don't lean on skill teaching as much as other therapists is because, first of all, it only makes sense. The skill only makes sense in the context of a new way of thinking. You can use a hammer to hurt somebody, or you can use it to build a house, and there's no intrinsic value in the hammer. It's only valuable in the context of the person utilizing the tool and what their intentions are. And you can't shortcut this. One of the important messages that I tell parents all the time, there's no faking it. There's no shortcutting. You can't use an intellect to shortcut emotional growth and emotional awareness. You can mask it to people who aren't aware, but our children, like Tion Dayton says, they absorb it. They can feel it. They can sense it. And so what a parent thinks, I wrote this in the Journey of the Heroic Parent, what a parent thinks and feels about the child becomes the voice in the child's mind, becomes the inner child. We start to think of ourselves the way that others think of us. And if others are worried about us and anxious about us and angry about us and disappointed in us, those have profound impacts on the development of the child. If a child is valued for what he or she does, how they look, how smart they are, kind of what they materially bring to the table, in psychological terms, we call that objectifying a person. If they start to become valued for their good or their positive traits, and we start to heap praise upon children for their talents and for their successes, the child learns through that process to discard, to ignore, to repress, to suppress failure, to avoid failure, to avoid situations where they might fail. Kind of the end message of tonight, one of the end messages I'll give away right now, which is that's why it's so important to find a therapist or a mentor or somebody in our lives at some point and spend a whole lot of time with them who can see all of us, who can tolerate, accept all of who we are, not just the pretty and the smart parts, but the ugly or the things that we've been taught are unacceptable. So the mind of our parents, the minds of our teachers, those are a big part of the context. And perhaps why they're so powerfully profound is because so much of it is implicit. I you can relate to this, I'm sure. So many people tell me it would have been easier had these things been said out loud. Or I have people who have been abused physically said, I would rather be abused physically than abused emotionally. Because you can kind of separate yourself from the overt craziness. but you can't separate yourself. It's like walking through a spider web. The implicit messages, you can't see them, but you can feel them and you can't get them off of you. Or I don't know if it's like, when I was a young child, sometimes even as an adult, I'll eat some breakfast with syrup on it. And then I find out later I have syrup on the back of my hand, right? On my left cheek, just under my eye. And I think, how did it get there? It's because it's invisible, because you can't see it. The minds, the thoughts, and the feelings of others are very powerful. That's why we can't fake it. That's why skills don't change it. That's why children are triggered at all ages, even late into adulthood, by the tone of voice of their mother or their father or their siblings or their in-laws or their children for that matter, because they can hear the under the table message. They can hear the implicit message. And what happens more in those situations when a 30-year-old woman snaps at her 55-year-old mother for something that she said, the 55-year-old mother is inclined to say, "What did I say? I didn't say anything. I didn't mean anything by it." Which of course further exacerbates the trigger. And the woman walks away angry, upset, with just a little sprinkle of self-doubt. It's in the air that we breathe, the context, right? It's in the soup that we're cooked in. The longer I do this work, and I'm not talking about being a therapist per se, I'm also talking about being a client, being a parent myself, the more I'm aware of how inescapable who we are is, that we can't not be who we are. And one way or another, we're going to get that message across to our children, and they're going to feel it and internalize it. All the messages about yourself, all the things that you're told, become part of the context. Jamie Gill writes, the experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, she says, what was very bad at home is now nothing. This difference in experience allows for the realizations things can be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. Part of psychotherapy, part of the peer milieu that I'm going to talk about, is when you tell your story to somebody and they look at you strangely because you assume that everybody thinks and feels and believes this thing. I'll give you an example from my own life. I remember 20 years ago saying to my therapist, I know how to get somebody to love you. I know how to get somebody to fall in love with you. And she looked at me with a crazy look on her face and said, how do you do that? And I said, well, you just deny your own needs and you prioritize the other person's needs, and they'll fall in love with you. And she looked at me with a kind of a curious sadness in her eyes. And she said to me, I think it's possible to be who you are and still be loved. And I looked at her like she was being crazy. Like maybe she was being strategic or playing a game with me. I wasn't quite sure. But what she was saying was incredulous, because in my context, in my codependent family growing up, that was the formula. People loved you if you denied your needs and put theirs first. End of story. End of equation. Now, many years later, I know what Jamie said is true. You can be yourself and be loved. You just have to find different people, and they will be attracted to you as you change. And that's been part of my own process. But it was just a therapist sitting across me saying, I don't necessarily have the same assumptions. I've had that exact same discussion when it comes to a child and a parent with many young men in the wilderness over the years. Most of my caseload has been young men. And so this isn't one of those casual conversations I have when I'm visiting a group and training a therapist. But when I've got into it with a student in our program, and I offer this same perspective that now I know that 20 years ago I didn't know, invariably, and I mean that word intentionally, invariably, the 15 or the 16 or the 17-year-old young man looks at me clear-eyed and says, nobody thinks what you think. Nobody believes what you believe. That's simply not true. So they begin to re-experience themselves in the presence of a new context, which in this case, the case that I just shared with you is you. Jamie goes on to say, part of the business of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken, she explains, in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves. That's really what contexts do, is you re-experience yourself in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. The wilderness is phenomenal for doing this. We take all of their clothes that they come with. We outfit them all the same. Socioeconomics kind of fade into the background. There are no mirrors out there because you don't need a mirror in the wilderness. The only mirror that you have out in the wilderness is the faces of your peers, the faces of the staff, the face of the therapist. Jamie explains what was once automatic and unconscious is noticed and discussed, like the story I just shared with you. The world is allowed to become one of noticeable constructions. In other words, we can't choose our context. We can't even choose it in a given moment. Many of the students don't come here by their own volition, right? Parents send them here. But through this experience of changing contexts, of seeing yourself in different places, in different cultures, which a group is a different culture, you start to decide to create your own construct, your own new sense of self. Jamie writes, just as I need external input to discover who I am, I need external experience to allow me to see my original context with understanding. This requires me to seek difference. It is from the position of difference I will be able to see and begin to understand where I am for the first time. One of the things that Jamie talks about in her work, she travels quite a bit. She travels all over the world. She spends a lot of time in Europe. And she does it because she enjoys the difference. She enjoys seeing herself from a different perspective, from a different base, seeing her parents, seeing American culture, seeing Utah culture from a different perspective. She sometimes playfully describes she sees some people walking in Vatican City like they're walking in a Walmart in Kansas City. You know, they're not in it. They're just kind of observing it from a distance. And she spends time in the cafes and just living in the community. Harville Hendricks wrote, we are born in relationship when we are wounded in relationship, and we can be healed in relationship. This is where I start to shift into the peer milieu. The peer milieu at Evoke is dynamic. It's ever changing. There are open groups, which means the group that you place your child in on December 8th, that's today's date. If you place your child on December 8th, won't be the same context 2 weeks from now on December 22nd or January 15th. It's ever changing. But those relationships allow you to learn about yourself. There are going to be times when you're in the group when you're the higher functioning member of the group. There are going to be times in the group when you're the lower functioning member of the group. And both have their value. Both give you perspective. Both allow you to see yourself more clearly. One of the great myths about people, and I wrote about this specifically in the myths at the end of the Audacity to Be You, is that we shouldn't need external validation. For some reason, that's taught to people, or it's something that people aspire to and try to create, and it's just silly. That's not how human beings develop. We are social creatures. The only reason that we are as dominant of a species on planet Earth is because we gather together in groups. As an individual animal, we're quite pathetic, right? We don't have fangs and claws. We have a pretty capable brain. It's quite amazing relative to other animals, and a lot of capacity for language and other things. But it's about being in groups. We are social. We make sense of ourselves. I experience myself, who I am, in the context and in the relationships that I'm in. And the fact is that we need external validation. It's necessary. The trick is to find a source who values the authentic self rather than some part object. In other words, find somebody who can see you. That's why the groups that you come to, when we have them in person, that's why you come. You come to the online groups. You listen and sit in the virtual forums and the Facebook page and the Instagram and the Twitter feeds at Evoke. You listen to the podcast. You do that because you want to surround yourself with people that are modeling a kind of awareness, a kind of life, a kind of evolution, a kind of journey that you want to live. So you surround yourself. I don't care how profound a therapeutic intervention is. You leave that context, you leave the therapist's office, you leave the Finding You intensive on this high, or the Finding Connection intensive as a couple on this high. And by the time you get to the airplane, it starts to fade. That's part of our biology. That's part of our neuroplasticity. It takes a while for these pathways, these neural pathways, to become clear and firm and somewhat consistent. Even though I'm going to talk about experiential therapy because that's the bulk of tonight's broadcast, I want to be clear that all therapy is experiential if you understand it. Because all therapy is walking into a room with another person and taking the risk to tell the truth about yourself. And the risk is that the therapist could treat you like you've been treated in your past relationships, in your family growing up, treated like you were by your parents. Last night at the speech I was given, I retold the story in the humorous story where I was driving my 13-year-old daughter. At the time, I believe she was 12. I was driving her to her therapy session because everybody in our family goes to therapy and she didn't want to be left out. So on a Saturday, pre-pandemic, I was driving her to her therapy session, and she said to me very casually, "Dad, what do you think I should talk about in therapy today?" And I said, "I have no idea. I couldn't possibly imagine what you should talk about. But what I can say to you is if you share something with your therapist and she tries to solve it for you or she tries to give you advice, you can tell her that you don't need that. You already have parents for that." I was giving her a clue of what therapy can be. It can be a place where you experience something different if you're lucky, if you find an adequate or a good enough therapist. And it takes time. So much of what I try to offer in the talks that I give or the intensive experiences, and I said this at my most recent intensive as we began. I said, we will not accomplish all the things that are to be accomplished in this family. We won't accomplish it at Finding You, at Finding Family, in a 10 or a 12-week wilderness course. We won't accomplish it. But hopefully you can get a taste. You can start to see. You can have some experience of the new way of being. I want to tell you something fascinating. It's a little bit of a detour, but it was so powerful. Brought chills to me when I heard it. I had shared on social media this week one of the quotes that I share that says that the adage, the idea that we're only as happy as our least happy child is a burden too heavy for any child to bear. I'd shared that on social media, and somebody in my social media circle had shared that on their page, and I was looking at the comments beneath it, and somebody had written to the comment, "Oh my," and the person who had posted it said this profoundly wise thing and compassionate thing. She responded to her friend who wrote "Oh my," and she said, "No judgment here. There is room for everyone on the other side of old thinking." right? That's the transformational process of the therapy of therapy. When we think about wilderness therapy and when we think about the peer milieu and the context, sometimes we think of it like we can engineer or control it. I have story after story after story, more stories than I would have time to tell you in a full day, of examples where something unplanned, something not designed, not assigned. Maybe it's a particular peer that enters the group. Maybe it's a staff member. Maybe it's an event that none of us have any control over. Something happens out there that contributes to the child's growth and learning more than anything that we designed. One of the things about wilderness therapy that makes it unique is that it's practical living. You're out there, and our version of wilderness therapy is primitive living. You build your shelter yourself. You carry everything you need for yourself and for the group on your back, hiking from place to place. It's a nomadic model. And that in that context, therapy happens, growth and change happens. When doing a review of wilderness therapy over the years, Will Wright wrote this. He took this from somebody else who was explaining their model. He said, whenever we adopted what we have come to call contrived experiences, the overall impact diminished for the participants. It's not the workbook assignments or the letters or the books. Those are part of the curriculum. But the real curriculum is the rain and the snow and the bugs and the peer that won't get out of his or her sleeping bag in the morning, or the one that won't listen and participate in chores, or the one that is still angry and furious for being here, or the one that's hyper compliant because they learned in their family that you just don't make waves. That becomes the curriculum. The peer milieu, the milieu in wilderness therapy becomes the rich teacher. It's so easy to be a therapist in wilderness therapy because the wilderness and the group does so much for you. Like I've been saying, talking about peer milieu now, contexts matter. They shape us over time into who we are. One of the most common questions we get from families as they're considering a wilderness program is, what if my child's group is negative? Even to the extreme, we've had situations where two peers that were behaving badly together come and end up in the same group. Doesn't happen often, but it happens on some rare occasions. You know, I don't want my child to learn negative things. I don't want my one of the interesting things that I always think about is they often ask about substance abuse. They're worried, and I think it makes sense to worry about it, that the child will learn about substances from other children in a treatment program. But the fact of the matter is that the microcosm of the group in wilderness is like the microcosm. Excuse me, it's like the life at home with the volume turned up. The great difference is, see, I used to get told when I started in wilderness therapy, when people would tell me about their child and their background and kind of how they got to this point of enrolling their child in the program, they would often explain the peer group that their child was hanging out with, the negative choices of peers and the negative peer influence. I used to tease people and say, if only we could get those negative peers in the program, we could really solve the problem across the board. Children are attracted to their negative peers for a reason. They're attracted to them because the threshold or the requirement for belonging is really low and really easy. They kind of know how to fit in. They're looking for something easy, some place to be that doesn't take a lot of effort. So parents are worried about negative influences. They're worried about substance abuse. On the rare occasion, and when I say rare, it's extraordinarily rare that friends show up together, but it has happened. Um, what I explain is we're getting to treat the issue in real time. I don't know if you the analogy I think works even if you haven't had the experience. Have you ever had a problem with a car and you bring it into the mechanic and you try to describe the sound or the experience of driving it? What is the problem? And you can't recreate it for the mechanic, and it's so frustrating. It's going to happen about 2 blocks away if you leave again with the car. It's kind of like that with our clients, with our students. We want to see how they respond to powerful, charismatic, negative peers. We want them to see how they respond and deal with more vulnerable peers, with peers who might be um, have a different way of thinking, a different way of learning. I remember I was recommending to somebody recently that they attend some of the 12-step support groups that we recommend, and they were asking which one was a good fit. And I said, ideally, you would go to a group where somebody had a spouse that was an alcoholic, somebody had a child that was self harming, somebody had a mother who had lost everything because they were a gambling addict, somebody who was there because their husband was a sex addict. Hopefully, you could go to a group where everybody, their surface level issues are different. And they said, why would you want me to go to that? And I said, because then you would have to listen for and see and discover what is the core issue that is consistent in all these situations. Group differences add a difference in context. What happens in the group after a while is, after the kid writes home and says everybody's worse than me, which is a very common letter, you know, tries to write in the letter that the parent's worst fear. This program is making me worse. After we get past some of that nonsense and debunk that story, what you will hear students say to each other is to the person next to them, they'll say, drugs weren't my issue, but lying was, or self-harm was, or school refusal was. I didn't steal medicine from my grandmother's cabinet, but this is how I'm the same. This is how I lied about my food, my eating, whatever it is. And so when you start to see different people with the same issue, you learn more. It's so easy to get distracted by the heroin or by the cutting or by the sex addiction or by the gambling addiction or by the alcohol. It's so easy to get distracted. That's what those symptoms are there for. They're supposed to distract you. Symptoms are something that we use to avoid the more authentic suffering, the more authentic feeling. And they work perfectly. You see a young girl, 95 pounds, emaciated, you can't help but think of food and calories and exercise. It's so easy to mistake that her core issues are the same as this person over here who's abusing alcohol, or this person sitting next to them who's self-harming and fantasizing about taking their own life. So what we get to see when your children is in a group with an array of other students is we get to see them. They become exposed. I remember I had a professor in my first year of graduate school. He said to me, "What you tell me about the devil tells me more about you than it does about the devil." I've never forgotten that. We want to see what your student, what your child does in these various contexts, because all of those contexts exist at home. That's why moving a child from one high school to another high school doesn't work, because they find their tribe quickly. And so you might have an array of various levels of mental health and mental illness, of substance abuse, of acting out or acting in behavior. You're going to have a decent array of that in a group. The difference is that we are there treating it in real time. The students aren't off by themselves talking. Everything is said essentially within the earshot of the staff. That's one of the rules of the adolescent program. And I would much rather treat your child's susceptibility to peer pressure with a negative peer right there than to simply treat it theoretically or by report. And the fact of the matter exists, like I said, the ideal is that there would be a time in the group when your child was on the higher functioning end of things, and there'd be a time in the group when your child is on the lower functioning end of things. We want to see them in both contexts, if possible, so that we can see them and find them and treat them. Some people ask about age. What are the specific issues, differences, and similarities? Again, I would choose every day. My group, the 17 years that I was a frontline wilderness therapist, I would choose every day to have a heterogeneous group instead of a homogeneous group. I would rather have a wide array of differences in levels of functioning because it's value for everybody. And in 2 weeks, it's going to shift. It's going to be upside down. It's going to evolve. And I continue to see as the group changes, as the milieu changes, I continue to see how your child responds to each aspect of it, each diagnosis. If your child is attracted to and learning from the substance abusing kids, it's happening at home or it's bound to happen at home. If they're falling under the wing, so to speak, of the charismatic positive leader in the group, we see how hungry they are for mentorship. If they're falling under the influence of the negative peer, we know how empty they're feeling. We know they're looking for something. As the great writer of the prophet says, that people will drink out of a poison pond when they're thirsty enough. So why is it your child is always giving audience to the positive or to the negative peer in their group? Having younger children, it's a great opportunity to mentor. We have a mentor program in the field, just like we do for parents out of the field. And often you're assigning someone to be a mentor when they're just on the verge of being ready for it, right? Because you learn more from teaching than you do from being taught so often. You invest more. My children have told me over the years, they'll have a debate with me about an idea or a concept in the world. And that when they leave the house and they're with their peers, they're defending the position that I was taking in the debate. You invest more when you're the teacher. If you're a younger child in an older group, you have mentors. You have people that have powerful personalities. They can serve in that role. One of the things about adolescence, I believe this. Mentoring is in many cases a more important aspect, a more important model for adolescents than is traditional talk therapy. Clients will tell you in this order, on the whole, that the most powerful impact for them in the program were the field guides, the staff. I'll talk about that in a minute. Secondly, they'll say their peers. Third, they'll say their therapist. I'm sorry. They also include in there, in the top two, they include the milieu, the environment, the primitive living, the challenge, the discomfort, and so forth. So it's staff, the physical milieu, the peers, and the therapist. Parents, on the other hand, will assign the most weight to the therapist because they're their contact with the program. Our groups are open groups, which means even if we place your child in a group because you demand it or request it that fits and looks and sounds like your child, age-wise, issue-wise, level of acuity-wise, in 2 or 3 weeks, it might shift. Someone's going to graduate, somebody's going to enroll in the program, and there's going to be a shift in it. That's the nature of the program, the nature of the context. Like I said, getting out of the context, children learn. Sometimes we have children that are low functioning in the group. And I will tell you this. I used to say this as a joke. Not right away, not flippantly, but I would say to students, this kid over here that's really pushing your buttons every day, who doesn't want to hike, who doesn't want to help, who gets in the way of every group challenge or every group activity. That kid, he's really not He's not a student. He has a rare disease that makes him look 14, but he's really 30 years old. He's a staff that we hire. And we hire them to get into the group to teach everybody what they need to learn. Students write home and they say things like, I think I know what you felt like, mom and dad. I got this kid, got this girl in my group who's driving me crazy. And I've done everything to try to help her or him or them. And nothing seems to work. And it's not just affecting them, it's affecting me. I can't imagine something that many parents would want to hear more than that. But to hear a child experience the parent's world. So all the levels of functioning, teach them. And what's amazing more often than not anyway is that the groups are incredibly nurturing and safe and non-judgmental. It's not always true. Sometimes you have some very angry, very biased students, but on the whole, I- I'm actually shocked by it. When I became a wilderness therapist 25 years ago, I couldn't believe how kind the kids were to each other on the whole. There's some exceptions, of course. Kids would come out about their sexual orientation, and years later they'd come out uh, with a sexual identity that was different than the sex that they were assigned at birth. And the kids in the group act like it's nothing. You sit and watch how somebody else listens to their hopes and intentions letter, you get as much out of it. You see how somebody struggles their first week there, you remember what it was like. The classroom and the teachers are everybody and everything. In many ways, the least of which is the therapist. The therapist kind of sits at the top of the treatment team, doing their best to kind of organize things. But there's so much happens out there that's outside of our control. And that's just like life. Social learning theory tells us that we learn by watching somebody else learn. We learn by watching somebody else struggle. We learn by watching somebody else fail. We learn by watching other people's reaction to us. And so if you're that child in the group that is pushing everybody's buttons, it gets really clear to you that this wasn't about your parents. That this getting sent to Evoke wasn't about your parents' weird idea, but that you seem to be creating a similar dynamic everywhere that you go. The staff serve as this kind of older brother mentor. Like I described, the therapist serves kind of like the conductor. I've heard it said that the musicians play the instruments and the conductor plays the musicians and puts them together. So we do our best to try to create creative interventions and dialogues and mentoring opportunities. We notice alliances and coalitions. We address it. We ask about it. We get curious. My son, when he went to Wilderness, was actually moved to another group as an intervention for a little while to see if that new context would wake him up to some things that he was ignoring, which it did, and he was annoyed by the move. At times you become a leader, and at times you become a follower, or at least you have the opportunity for both those things, and we take advantage of both. So the wilderness therapy is a delivery method. Wilderness therapy is primitive living nomadic wilderness therapy in a small group milieu. That's our delivery method. And on top of that, we use traditional psychotherapies. And I won't go over all the various models that all the therapists use. All of it is founded on the attachment-based therapy model at Evoke. But the grist for the mill is in what happens every day. I've said this before, but it's worth referencing. That's why Harvard University has discovered and published that primitive living wilderness programs, primitive living nomadic wilderness experiences, are some of the most profound and provocative classrooms for people to learn. It's why NASA, the space program for the United States, uses primitive living nomadic models to help teams work out their differences, work on their communication, work on their trust, work on their team building. And that when we try to create activities or exercises that are contrived, the impact diminishes. Wilderness therapy is like life, only more. The relationships, the challenges, the dynamics out there are just like life, but we're taking them from the larger universe and putting them into a small universe where it's manageable, where we can more effectively make a diagnosis, make a prognosis, and a treatment plan. See where your child's strengths and vulnerabilities are. I wrote this in The Journey of the Heroic Parent. Therapy is a place that we go to receive a different response than the one we received from our earlier contexts, to be received completely and entirely. An adequate therapist responds to our warts, our wounds, and our symptoms with calmness, understanding, patience, and curiosity. This therapist is not anxious to fix us, but rather is passionate about finding us. And when we are found and seen without the anxiety, frustration, or disappointment we experienced in our earlier context, we come to believe that we are okay. We're able to look deeply into ourselves, into our wounds, and our traumas with compassion and understanding, and we heal. The context, the milieu, is the teacher. In so many ways, as a therapist and even a field guide, we're somewhat of a passenger on this powerful delivery method. When we talk at Evoke about the therapeutic process, when I talk to you on these broadcasts, we're talking and inviting and encouraging a fundamental transformation, not a superficial change, not about the acquisition of skills, although that does happen, not about shifting one or two ideas, but like the person that I shared with you earlier explained, that there's room on the other side of old ways of thinking for all of us. It's a new way of being in the world, a new way of understanding what it means to be a human, a self, a new way of understanding love, a new way of understanding connection and intimacy, and friendships in the parent-child relationship, and therapist to child and child to therapist, and so forth. Jamie writes, since rational argument and learning won't work, what will? It would seem any improvement in the situation requires a direct experience of a different context. This is why transformation has had such a significant history. Typically, when you learn something, the base does not shift. The fundamental core belief does not shift. In a transformation, however, it is precisely the base that shifts. It is the nature of a transformation that things are seen from a different angle. Also, the more pronounced the base shift, typically the more profound the transformation. Jamie explained in one of her books specifically about wilderness therapy that its effectiveness is the difference in the context, where a child gets to experience themselves in a radically different context. And it's only in that kind of shift do the deepest of our beliefs and assumptions come into the light and get questioned and selected. From the audacity to heal, therapy clients must re-experience themselves in the presence of an empathic other. This will create the self-compassion in the client required to expand self-awareness. The end result is what Freud suggested was the goal of therapy: freedom, and specifically freedom from unconscious obligations. So part of what I want to suggest this evening, the take home, is that wilderness therapy is not about the psychological model that you're taught on your weekly phone calls or even on these broadcasts. It's about an experience with others, and that experience with others that are different creates a new experience of oneself, of yourself. It's a safe context, because not because every peer is rushing toward the light in life, But because when they struggle and when there are negative dynamics, we're there. We're on top of it. We're treating the like the mechanic. We get to see how the car reacts when it's accelerating up to 65 miles an hour. We get to see what your child does when they're around a substance abusing peer who's constantly war storing and bragging about their substance use. We get to see what it's like when they're around a 17-year-old or a 13-year-old. And we get to intervene and manage it in real time. The reason I focus on contexts over genetics so often is because we don't have control over the genetics, at least not yet. The only thing we can control is to look back with courage into what we've learned and what we've taught our children and to re-experience it as different. And even if you're not capable, one of the reasons why I drop my children off at the soccer practice or the softball practice or the baseball practice or the violin lesson is not just so they can play violin and play soccer. I do it because I want them to experience a different kind of adult than me. It's not always better than me, of course, but I want them to wake up. And one of the ways that we wake up is by this experiencing of differences, positive and negative. And when a child is susceptible to somebody that's charismatic and going in a negative direction, that's important information to know, not just in terms of what we recommend for you in terms of the next step or the things that need to be in place for the next step, but it tells us something about the makeup of the child's psyche. I explained recently, borrowed from somebody else, the terminology that children that are invested in pleasing parents or at least overwhelmed with the pressure to please parents grow up to be people pleasing people. And if they ever have children and they don't do their work, they grow up to be child pleasing parents. And the way to discover that is to insert them into a milieu where you can observe them closely and unfold the current real time dynamics. One of the things you learn at Evoke is that you're not bad. You're a you. You're who you are, which includes some very, very beautiful things, talented things, amazing things, and also some dark things, some mistakes, some flaws, some broken pieces. That's ultimately the goal of therapy, the way that I describe it, or the outcome, I guess, of really good therapy is that you realize that you are a beautiful miracle and a disaster all at the same time. And exposing yourself to a peer milieu, especially one like Evoke with primitive living and nomadic, where you have to work together to cook breakfast, right? Everything takes intention. Everything takes teamwork. Moving from one side to another takes a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of teamwork. And that's really where the therapy happens, whether the group is doing it well or not. When I have a group that's struggling to function, I tell the staff, I'm not going to give you a lot of assignments or group topics to work on. It's all right there. Just hike 5 days this week before I come back for my 2-day visit. Hike 5 days, do the laundry, keep their feet warm and dry, their hands warm and dry, keep them hydrated the best you can. And you'll have plenty to work on in the context of those tasks, especially with 6 or 7 or 8 kids that didn't choose to be together, that have very different ways of thinking, that have different kinds of intelligences, different strengths and experiences. I don't need, on top of that, to give you a bunch of cognitive behavioral assignments. You'll be able to tease that out when this 17-year-old kid can't get along with this 13-year-old kid, or when this substance abusing kid thinks that the other kid is worse than him or vice versa. You'll have plenty to work on when that comes up, and it will. The problem is that many parents want an exact match, and that's not clinically indicated. We want differences. We want shifts. We want complementary intelligences and behaviors and even levels of functioning and acuity. I've learned just as much from the people who have struggled the most as I have from the people that are most successful. I might even argue that I've learned more from the people that have struggled than the people who seem to be going through things effortlessly. I've learned more from drug addicts than I've learned from professors. And it's really not even close. I've learned more from 14-year-old kids who are cutting on themselves than any professor I ever had. Because that's how we make sense, is that's how we learn about ourselves, is through the experience and the contact with another. All right. Looks like we're out of time. I'll take questions for next week. Just kind of run through. If you want to read something, my 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon, also on Audible. If you want to attend a group for that community feeling, the next one will be tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. for current and alumni wilderness families. We also have one meeting per month that is for our alumni parents, and that'll be on December 28th this month at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. If you're an intensive alumni member, December 14th at 6 p.m. In either case, email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do a deep dive in your own group and get into a new context, the next intensive available in person is January 12th through 16th, or online January 28th through 30th. The online ones we are broken up into 2 parts. They're half the cost. You don't have to travel. You can do it over a weekend. But I can't think of anything. I really cannot think of anything more impactful on your child than for you to do the work that these intensives do with people. We'll come up with a returning to you, a kind of the sequel after the first of the year. We have Evoke Therapy trained therapists, coaches. We do coaching online, virtually, video, or phone call. So if you want somebody to help you do your work, contact coaching@evoketherapy.com. We also have pursuit trips for families and young adults, anywhere from 3 days to 30 days. You can do it after the program, in between the program. You can do it to catch up, to recalibrate, to reconnect to your work. Think of it as therapy light, sober fun, adventure, customized, mixed with therapy. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org to find resources and classes that are free in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on any podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast on your favorite app or on your favorite podcast app, or go to soundcloud.com. You can find me and Evoke on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @Evoke Therapy or @Dr. Brad Reedy. You can also find the Evoke Intensives program on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog, wonderfully curated by Malia, who is our moderator, is available on our website with new content each week. My next broadcast, I'm going to be doing 2 next week before my vacation. So my next one will be a Q&A for families. Anything left over or anything you want to bring to the table for that, any topic, is fine. December 14th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. You can also invite extended family, siblings included. If you have questions, you can send them in advance to webinar@evoketherapy.com, and we'd be happy to put those at the top of the queue when I do the Q&A next week, December 14th. After that, I'll be reading the book and reviewing the book entitled "What Happened to You" by Dr. Bruce Perry, and Oprah Winfrey. So I've gotten some requests for that. Thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you for and on behalf of the people that love you, for you being willing to do your work. It makes all the difference in the world. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.